So welcome everyone. This is the final session in our webinar series. This session is all about personal statements. So what are we going to cover in today's session? Well, first of all, we're going to talk about what the personal statement is, the UCAS personal statement. And I should note at this point that this is being recorded in July of 2024. So the most up-to-date information will always be on the UCAS website for the personal statements. Then the next part of today is going to be about the structure. So we're going to go through some suggested ways of formatting your personal statement, ways of putting things together, how to put the content into the personal statement, because there's not that much space in your personal statement, as we'll discuss. And section 3 will be what to include as well. So talking about the research paragraphs, as we like to call them, how to put those together, how to portray your super-curricular exploration, all of your subject exploration that you've done, how to put that in a personal statement. And then finally, we'll look at some examples of personal statement sentences and how you might redraft them, because redrafting is a major part of your personal statement. You won't just write one and then you'll be done. You'll start thinking about it, write a first draft and subsequent drafts, and then a final one. So redrafting is a really important part of personal statements. So that's why it's got its own section. So what is it? Well, currently, and UCAS are updating their guidance for future years, but currently the personal statement is 4,000 characters, including blank spaces, or 47 lines, including blank lines. So it's about 500 to 600 words. It's roughly one side of A4. And essentially, your personal statement will be answering the following couple questions. What is it about the prospect of studying this particular subject or course at university level which most interests you? Why is this something that appeals to you? You're going to be studying that subject or course for 3+ years. On average, it'll be 3 or 4, but if you're doing things like medicine, it'll be 6 years, for instance. So what is it that really interests you about studying it at university level? And this is, of course, a related question, what are the skills and experiences that you've gained that have prepared you for studying this subject or course at university level? So what is the point? So we use personal statements at universities. The admissions teams use personal statements in many different ways and for many different reasons. We want to understand you. It's your personal statement. It's your individual applicant self representing your interests, motivations, your knowledge of your subject area. So we really use it to get a better picture of you that we wouldn't otherwise have if we didn't have this piece of written work from you. Excuse me. We also use the personal statement to confirm your commitment to your chosen subject or course. So if you're going to be studying this for 3+ years, as I've said, you've got to be committed in order to do that. So the personal statement should be evidence of your commitment for that chosen subject or course. We'll go on in future sections of this session how you can demonstrate that commitment, because it's not just saying, I want to study this subject. You've got to show, not tell, essentially, in the personal statement, but we'll cover that shortly. And then we also use the personal statement to find out how you yourself have taken the initiative to independently explore your subject or course area. So this is often called super-curricular exploration. It's something that you, as an individual applicant, as a prospective university student of that subject, you are essentially thinking like a university student by doing this subject exploration. What that can look like and how you can represent that in your personal statement, we will cover in a later section. And we also use it really crucially. We don't just use it on its own. We use it in conjunction with all the other elements of your application. So all of the other bits in the UCAS form, and for universities like Cambridge and Oxford, we also have other elements of our application process, such as interviews, admissions tests, the teacher's reference in your UCAS statement as well. That's a a really important example. The personal statement will support and complement, so the student's statement will support and complement what the teacher has put in their reference as well. So we never look at the personal statement in isolation. We'll never make decisions based purely off a personal statement alone. This is not how we, certainly at Cambridge, and I'm sure it's the case at other universities, it's not how we assess applications. We assess you holistically and in context as well. So each individual applicant, we look at all the different elements of your application process, and the personal statement is one of those elements. And for universities or courses that interview applicants, so Cambridge, Oxford, we interview candidates, but there are other universities, I think often for STEM courses, for science courses, that also have interviews as part of the process. The personal statement will potentially provide an interesting starting point, a springboard for discussion in that interview. The teacher's statement, just to confirm, the teacher's reference, I should call it the teacher's reference, is a completely separate part of the application. So both your personal statement as the student, what you're writing, and the teacher's reference, which usually your head of sixth form will write, they are both in the UCAS form that you will submit. They're completely separate. So your personal statement then, how could you structure it and what should you put in it? So we would advise that around 80%, so the vast majority of your personal statement, should be academic in its focus. And the reason that we give that advice at Cambridge is because our courses are really academic. So that bulk of your personal statement should include an introduction, and the main part of it will be paragraphs that evidence what you've done by way of independent exploration, that's super-curricular activities, those subject exploration activities that I talked about before, within your chosen subjects that have interested you. So you will be, as I said before, showing, not telling us that you want to study this subject at university level, because the majority of your statement will be you telling us what you've already done by way of university level thinking and learning in that subject. And the other 20% of your personal statement should summarize, and it's there that you can include wider skills, wider experiences that you've gained that might be relevant for your subject or course that you will be studying. So an example structure, and this is by no means, I must stress this, and I'll probably say this multiple times in today's session, I cannot give you a sort of a golden rule. I cannot give you a template. That sort of thing doesn't exist. Your personal statement, clues in the name, it really is personal for you. So your personal statement might be structured differently to the examples that I'm showing you today, of the ways you can structure paragraphs and things like that, and how you would move on into your next paragraph to talk about something different. But this is just an example of the sorts of things that we would like you to cover in your personal statement. So with the 80% being academic, course related, and the additional skills and experiences for the remaining 20%. So introduction, interests in your subject, how you can demonstrate that to us with examples, wider skills, wider experiences that you've gained, and then maybe a sort of summing up statement. I will take questions at the end, but I'm just going to get through the majority of my slides. So do have your questions ready for me afterwards. The introduction, so around 800, 1,000 characters, including blank spaces. Again, this is just a rough guideline to give you a sense of what you can include and how to sort of fit it all together. So this would set out what subjects you're interested in studying and why you have chosen it. So you might also want to put in an introduction key questions, ideas, and issues. Which topics or areas interest you the most within your prospective university course or subject? So that's showing us that you understand, you've done your research, you understand what this subject actually entails by way of university level study. And then you would move on to demonstrate, again, show, not tell. Give us evidenced examples of your interest, your informed enthusiasm for your subject or your course. So this would be the bulk of the statement. So approximately 2,200 to 2,400 characters, including blank spaces. So you could have maybe 2, 3, 4, thereabouts, research paragraphs, depending on the length, of course, of the sentences and the paragraphs. They provide the evidence, the examples of your independent subject exploration, your super-curricular research. We'll come to what exactly super-curricular research can look like later in the session, but that's where they go. So what are these research paragraphs meant to do? They're meant to demonstrate, as I've said before, that university level approach to your subject. So you're showing to us that you're a prospective student in this course. So they need to be critical and analytical. If you've read something or watched something that you find interesting and it's related to your subject area and it's made you rethink something, then great, tell us why. But if you've read something and it goes against something else that you've discussed, having watched a documentary or listened to a podcast, or something that you've learned during class, you can challenge what you read, what you discover. Just make sure that everything, as you would in a good academic essay for school and indeed at university, just make sure that everything you're saying, opinion wise, is backed up by evidence. But you can be critical, you can be analytical. We really do encourage that. Make sure that your research paragraphs are really relevant and focused. So avoid generalizing. Give us explicit and specific examples. So within chemistry, there are many different topics that you can study. So it would be a good idea, rather than just talking very generally about chemistry, to pick out maybe 2 or 3 topics that really interest you, and talk about them, focus on them. So make sure it's relevant to your subject area and avoid generalizing. And then also, research paragraphs should be supported with examples, and opinions should be backed by evidence. I've already said this, I suppose. Make sure as well, crucially, that everything you're mentioning in your personal statement, you have actually read. So any books, any articles that you are talking about, make sure that you've read them. And if you were to discuss them in interview, you would be able to talk a little bit more about them. We'll come on to that in some of the tips and advice later, but that's a really important thing to stress at the start. You need to make sure that you are familiar with the things that you're mentioning in your personal statement. So that basically means you've read them and you've reflected on them. And then wider skills and experiences and your conclusion. So this is around 800 characters, including blank spaces. So it's the remainder really of the personal statement. This is your section that you would use if you wanted to discuss any opportunities or experiences that you've had that have given you transferable skills, maybe transferable skills in the context of study, or your chosen course. So this can vary for things where there's a clear vocational element or subsequent path from the university course. So I'm thinking of things like architecture, or veterinary medicine. Then it might be that these wider experiences and wider skills actually feature more in the bulk of the body of the personal statement. So this is why I've said at the outset, there isn't a one size fits all for personal statements, how to structure them, or indeed what you should put in them. This is just the advice and guidance that we would give our applicants. You can conclude as well with a brief summarizing sentence, perhaps one that looks forward to your university studies or beyond. So it could be talking about career paths. So I mentioned the vocational elements there of some courses. But you could also say that there might be a module or a dissertation topic that links to what you've just said in your previous 3 research paragraphs, and you know that that would be an option for you, or something like a coursework essay, and it would be something that you could say at the end that you're really keen to learn more about. So that's an example of how you can sum it up. Don't worry, and I'm sure this will come in my do's or don'ts, but I'll say it now just in case. Don't worry about making your personal statement a real sort of finishing with, a real flourish. It really doesn't need to be memorable in that sense. You don't need to start it with something that's going to make jaws drop. You don't need to end it with something that's going to be memorable in that sense. You just need to make sure that the content of your personal statement is, as I've said on this slide, it's all genuine to you. It's honest, and you've given us evidenced examples. That's the core of this slide on do's. So make sure that it's your motivations and interests in the subject or course. That's really crucial, not just what you think we would like you to be interested in. So the books we think you should have read if you're going to study English literature, or the sorts of maths equations that you might find interesting. We don't have sort of a list of things that we are looking for you to mention. We really do want to understand what your interests in the subject are. A crucial do that I haven't mentioned so far is, with the redrafting process, make sure you're checking the spelling and the grammar. You can, reading over this, having a fresh eye, asking someone else to read over it. Reading it out loud yourself as well also really helps um, figure out if what you've written sort of makes sense and flows, and isn't just one long sentence that you've not realized hasn't got a full stop in it. And yeah, I've already said, make sure you're supporting everything you say with evidence, reflecting on it with your own opinions, and be positive, I think, as well. Be positive. Although you can be critical, you can say, "Oh, I found this source that an article or a documentary. It didn't consider the angle from a gender perspective or a class perspective, or it would be really interesting to see this approach in that article directed more broadly to other areas of this subject. Whatever that topic or question or problem is, you can be critical and give your opinion and say what you think. But overall, be positive. We don't want you to list all of the things that you don't enjoy about your subject area. Obviously, we want to understand from you what you do find interesting within your subject area. And that won't be the same for every student studying the same course, right? Everyone studying geography, for instance, some people will really enjoy certain elements of it, and other people will enjoy completely different elements of the course. So make sure that you are positive with that. The little hyperlink that I've got at the bottom, it's useful, I think, for you to familiarize yourself in the age that we are now, the age of ChatGPT, to have a look at our statement that we have about the use of AI in undergraduate applications. So it's really important that if you are going to use ChatGPT for your studies, that you don't essentially ask ChatGPT to write your personal statement for you. That's obviously not a good idea. So make sure that you aren't plagiarizing. Make sure that you're being honest in your personal statement. Seems obvious, but it's worth reminding people. Some don'ts then. So avoid cliches. Avoid quotations. They take up a lot of space sometimes, and they're not your opinion. So best to avoid them, really, really sort of effusive quotations, and avoid fancy language. So the statement, it should sound like you. It should sound like you as you would in an academic essay. And a good point to note is that you can use subject-specific technical terms and jargon where relevant. Don't overuse these to try and sound impressive, but where relevant, use them. And just remember that you're talking to a subject expert. So you don't need to provide dictionary definitions for the terms or the jargon that you're using. So don't waste space, don't waste characters in your personal statement doing that. Don't make jokes as well. Sometimes people think that again will make it memorable, but as I said before, we're not looking for a personal statement to be memorable in that sense of something that really makes us go, oh, and stops in our tracks. It's not what we're looking for. It's an academic, professional piece of work, and that's how you should approach it. Make sure that you're not referencing one specific university course. Your application needs to appeal to each of the 5 universities that you're applying to. The exception of mentioning a specific university is when you're referring to super-curricular activities or resources or topics or lectures that you've done or attended that have been part of, for instance, a summer school or a competition. So you can reference that if you're talking about the lecture that you attended at a particular summer course, or if you're talking about a particular essay competition run by a certain institution, you can absolutely reference that to be explicit and to give that evidence example, as we've talked about. But that is the exception that proves the rule, really. Make sure that you aren't generalizing, waffling, repeating, using sort of filler. When you first draft your personal statement, you may find that you have lots of sort of waffle in that sense in the first few drafts, but that's fine because that's what the redrafting process is for. But ultimately, every single sentence in your personal statement should be worth the space and the characters that sentence takes up. And similarly, this last point, don't start every sentence with I. This is a really good way of, in your first draft, getting pen to paper, or I guess words on the Word document, getting out onto a page your ideas and what you want to put in your personal statement. But ultimately, when you've redrafted it, we would definitely recommend that you vary your sentence structure a little bit, again, just like you would in another academic piece of work that you've written for school. One piece of advice that I would give you as well is to use what's out there in terms of academic skills, resources. So there's guidance for developing academic skills, reading academic articles, making notes, avoiding plagiarism. And you can use this resource that I've linked specifically, CAM Guides, to help you write your personal statement. It's specifically designed for prospective undergraduates. There's also a level for prospective postgraduate students as well. But if you look on the undergraduate CAM Guides, which is the one I've linked on the slides, you will get a copy of the slides as always. I will send that round in an email. So if you have a look on CAM Guides, you will find lots of resources and guidance about general academic skills. And a lot of those skills will support you writing your personal statement. So I wanted to mention it here. I know that we've talked about this in previous sessions, but this is relevant for personal statements. So some overused opening lines from UCAS personal statements. The reason that I've put them here is because they just, yeah, it's really important, I think, to remember that it can be really tempting to use these sort of cliche openings, but a lot of these really aren't a good way to start a research paragraph in your personal statement, or really don't say much at all. What these overused opening lines are good for, though, and the reason why I've put them in this presentation is because they can be quite good writing prompts. If you've got any sort of journal, or if you do any sort of writing and you've got prompts that start you off on a creative piece of writing, for instance, that's a really good way of getting pen to paper, getting words on a page, whatever. So some of these opening lines, although they will not hopefully feature in your final draft that you submit of your personal statement, they can actually be quite good ways of thinking, okay, yeah, what is actually my interest in this course? What do I really like about this subject? But overall, avoid saying these sorts of phrases, because they do just take up a lot of space in terms of characters. And I'm sure from a young age, but people often say, since I was a child, I've always been interested in history, or every day I'm making new scientific discoveries, and these sorts of lines that they're not very believable or genuine, and they also just take up character space. So it's best to avoid them, but they can be useful in your drafting phase of your personal statement. So what resources, what activities can form the content that goes into your personal statement, those research paragraphs, the evidenced examples of the super-curricular exploration that you've done? Well, it's more than just books certainly, but lots is actually free to access online. So news websites, podcasts, blogs, magazines, journals, documentaries, YouTube courses, video essays, but also lectures that have been recorded and have been uploaded to YouTube, open access research repositories, research libraries, museum exhibitions, both in person and online, competitions. We run the poster competition at St John's. And I've also got an example of a subject resource hub there, which is the HE+, so it's a Cambridge resource of subject resources. So all sorts of things can help you find super-curricular activities and resources that you can use as part of your personal statement content building exercise. I've got some examples of the sorts of things that I've mentioned on that previous slide. So we have some academic magazines, we have museums, JSTOR is a place where you can find academic articles. We've got some documentary series, podcasts, lots of places where you can practice maths and science-based problems. So things like Enrich and I Want to Study Engineering. Lots is out there. You really are very fortunate to be in the position where you have loads of resources at your disposal. So how would you build up this bank of potential personal statement content? Well, first of all, you've got to find the super-curricular resources that you can use. So you would ask for recommendations from your teacher, from your school librarian, your local librarian. Use the book index. Use those resource hubs, repositories that you can search for by key terms and different subject terms. Use categories, use keywords. Find your resources that way. But then once you've found them, make sure you're understanding why the article was written, the purpose of the article. Make sure you're really assessing it and ensuring that it has academic credibility. Does it cite its arguments? Does it can its arguments hold water, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. And then once you have, let's say it's an article, once you've read that article, can you summarize it in your own words? What have you learned from it? Could you tell someone else who hasn't read it the main points, the main arguments in your own words, maybe in a minute? Can you summarize what you took from that article? What did you find interesting? So this is step 4, reflect and respond. So this is really where what you do in step 4 will form what you can talk about in your personal statement. So reflecting and responding. What are the opinions and questions that you're left with? Were there any knowledge gaps from new concepts or terminology in the resource? So in the article, were there any words that you didn't understand? You had to go and look them up. Where did that lead you? Can you find an alternative viewpoint if that's relevant to the article that you've read? And then as you do more and more of this super-curricular research and exploration, can you make connections between that article that you've just read and the documentary that you watched last week? So pulling those connections together in your reflections are really, really important, because often in the personal statement paragraph, the real the content that you'll want to put in there will be things that you have sort of done across many different articles. So it won't just be that you've read one thing and you're talking about that one thing that you explored or discovered. It might be, for instance, that you looked at a few different artifacts in an exhibition and you thought about interesting ways that they speak to each other. Or you were thinking about one material and its uses across many different areas of science or technology. So connections can be a quite useful way to put your personal statement together. So that's why I've put it as a separate line there in italics. Step 5, discuss. This is really helpful, this step, to consolidate what you've learned from the articles that you've read, for instance. And also, it's really useful because if you discuss with someone else, you can share ideas and share resources with your peers. This step is also helpful if you're thinking about how to best prepare for interviews, for application interviews for Oxford, for Cambridge, for other courses, because if you're practicing talking out loud about the things that you've discovered and explored, that's going to stand you in really good stead when you're doing that in what essentially is an academic conversation at an Oxbridge interview, for instance. And then step 6 sort of tells you to go right back to the start. This should be a really organic process whereby you're finding things, thinking about connections, searching in the book index of the chapter that you've just read, watching the documentary of the author, which features the author of the book you've just read, thinking about how you can sort of bounce off all these different resources. It should be this really organic journey that sort of snowballs, essentially. Follow wherever your curiosity leads. So it might have been one small thing that was mentioned in a footnote of the article, and you think, oh, actually, that's what I'm really interested in. The main point of the article was actually not something you wanted to explore further. What's really interested you is some small mention of some author in the footnote, for instance, and then you've gone off and you've researched that and their work. So wherever your own enthusiasm and curiosity leads you, that's where you should head next, and continue this step-by-step process, essentially. And the 2 key takeaway messages here, really important that you remember it's what you think that matters. We want your opinions backed up by evidence. We don't want you to say what you think we'll find impressive. Please do just say what you think is interesting, taking from the articles and all of the other super-curricular activities and resources that you've consumed, essentially. But don't just regurgitate, to continue that metaphor, don't just regurgitate and repeat essentially what other people have already said. Think about what you think, what's interesting to you, what have they missed, what could your perspective bring to the subject, because you are the people that will be studying this subject in the future, and you may end up being a researcher in this subject. So really think like a university student, think with that independent research, that critical thinking at the forefront. And then the second key message here on the right, make sure you're keeping a log or a record of all of this super-curricular exploration. It's really important. You may already be doing this, and that's great, but if you aren't, start now, so that when you come to write your personal statement and submit it in a couple months' time, perhaps, you have the ability to go back and find the author, the title of the article, and your first thoughts when you read it back in July. Right, so keep this super-curricular personal statement record. It can be Notes app, it can be a Word document, Google Doc, it can be a physical journal. just make sure that you're keeping a record, because then you can come back and refer to it and you won't be sat there thinking, I know I read something, or I know I saw something, but I can't remember where it was. So you can't go back and sort of refresh and read it again or watch it again. So make sure you're keeping a record of what you're discovering. So an example paragraph template now. So how would you write about your super-curricular journey in your personal statement? Well, as I was saying before, it really is this organic process of your own individual subject exploration that we want to see in your personal statement. So a way that you can structure a paragraph in your personal statement, and I will stress again, this is not the only way. This is by no means the best way. This is just an example to illustrate what I've been talking about so far. So some sort of super-curricular resource or idea, the springboard thing, the article, the documentary, the podcast, something, the lecture at the summer school. This prompted me to, and then it could be something like, reconsider the impact of a particular topic or issue or question from the angle or perspective that that article that's been your springboard was talking about. And then you could say, having studied this, either as part of your A levels or you've researched it for a project, EPQ, some other super curricular thing that you've done, I wanted to understand more about that issue, that question from that particular angle or perspective, for instance. So I explored this further with, and then you talk about another article, resource, documentary, podcast, lecture, and then I think that, and then you would discuss the resources arguments, the ideas that the authors put forward. Perhaps they're disagreeing in interesting ways. You'd be analytical. You'd be giving your own opinions and your own perspectives, and you'd think, okay, what are the important questions that this resource throws up for me, essentially? And then your next paragraph after that one might be you reflecting on a resource on a similar topic, or maybe it's one from a different perspective or in a different context, different time or space-based context. So you can link them in interesting ways. You connect your paragraphs in interesting ways. That's just one example of how you could structure it. And that, I hope, has shown you what I mean by the idea of using your super-curricular exploration to form the bulk content of your personal statement. You're explaining essentially to us what you've done, what you found interesting, and what you think. So I've got here an example paragraph, not a real one, from a personal statement. So a personal statement paragraph. And we're going to go through line by line. You might see already some glaring errors or issues with this paragraph. What we've discussed in terms of the do's, the don'ts, how to put the content into your personal statement, what we're looking for. We're going to discuss all of that, but with an actual example so that we can sort of walk through all of the different points. So for the first part, then, we're going to take this chunk by chunk. From an early age, I have been interested in the study of history. What would you say is good or could be improved about that? Let's say this is the first line in the personal statement. Could you put your thoughts in the chat box for me? Yeah, bit cliche. It reminds me of some of the overused lines, overused opening lines from that previous slide. But it's good in the sense that it states the subject that they wish to study. It does get to the point, but it does so in, yes, absolutely, in a sort of inauthentic cliche way. So absolutely, I think you've got it exactly right. It's a bit vague, it's a bit cliche. This is one of the most common opening lines. It doesn't really tell me much at all. You could delete that line, or you could change it and immediately be more specific. What activity, what resource, what was the interest? And you could use that sort of springboard template approach that I shared in the previous slide. So visiting a museum's exhibition, attending blah, blah, blah lecture on XYZ sparked my interest in this topic. This curiosity developed into the basis of my research project, my essay, my EPQ on a related topic, or maybe a more specific question within that overarching subject. So you get straight into it, basically. You talk about one of the things that you've done that can demonstrate to us as university admissions staff and subject directors of studies, so people who are going to teach you in your course, you're demonstrating to us what you've done, and you're being specific about it. So yeah, absolutely. What do we think about this next part? I find studying the lives of people in the past fascinating and important. What do we think about this highlighted section? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree. I also would, who would disagree, one might say. Absolutely. Telling, not showing. It's not specific. It's not giving us evidence or examples. It's an opinion, and it's, I think, a really good one. But it's already implicit for both you and the reader. Remember that your audience, you're writing for a subject expert. You're writing for someone, in this case, history, for a historian, someone who has literally dedicated their lives to studying history and everything that that entails for their specific research topic. So yeah, it's already implicit, so you don't need to say it. It uses up the character count without actually demonstrating something specific or giving an evidenced opinion. So yeah, you probably would get rid of that or rephrase it as a launch into something else, as we saw in that first slide. Then the next part of this goes on. As Churchill said, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. What would you say about this part of the paragraph? Yeah, it's a quotation. What does it add here? Um, Interestingly, and I'm just wondering if anyone spotted it in the chat. I can't say, but when I was researching this, I actually found that it's not actually technically a Churchill quotation. So he's actually paraphrasing someone else, but it's often attributed to him. So make sure if you are doing things like this, if you're mentioning particular facts and everything, you make sure you're fact checking. Essentially, is the first lesson to be learned from this part. And there's an interesting source that you can look up there that I've included on the slide there. What you could do with something like this is either get rid of it because, as you've said, as a quotation, unless you're going to analyze it, it kind of wastes some of the characters in the space. So either get rid of it or find a way to represent it with your own opinion in your own words using an example. Also, be specific. It doomed in what way? It's like the previous part. The lives of people in the past is way too general, right? So either you could delete and not use a quotation like this, or you could actually make it the launch pad for a paragraph which discusses how some quotes that are attributed to certain people or some sayings are often misattributed. So you can use this as sort of a launch pad to talk about other examples, reflecting on maybe why this happens and what scholars have suggested about this and what's interesting about this. Who, for instance, for some discoveries, the people who actually made the discovery, they're overlooked in history, right? So you could talk about this with DNA, with lots of other scientific discoveries. Unfortunately, often the people that actually worked hard and really discovered it aren't the ones that get their sort of name in lights, as it were. So that's a really interesting thing to talk about, right? The misattribution. There we go. That's hard to say. Of a quotation, and that could be something that you end up talking about in your personal statement. So that's something to think about. And then the final part of this research paragraph, and I am coming swiftly to the end, so I will take your questions shortly. Thank you very much for popping those in the Q&A box while I've been talking. This final part, I have recently become particularly fascinated by the way that history is affected by people's perceptions and biases. Um, what issues do you see here? There are a couple. Yes, absolutely. So it's good in the sense that it's more specific. We finally got to a bit that is quite specific. It's talking about people's biases, people's perceptions, but it's still quite general because specific examples, eras, people, biases. None of these things are mentioned. So I'm being unfair. I guess the rest of the paragraph could, in theory, go on to be specific. This could be just the first part of it. But affected, first of all, is incorrect. So run your personal statement through something like Grammarly, or write it out in Word with the spell checker, grammar checker turned on, before you then paste it or type it out into the UCAS text box that's there in the UCAS form, and ask someone to read it through for you to check these sort of errors. But what you could do is you could expand it to include specific examples. You could see if you could cut it down because it is quite long. You could maybe make it a little bit more punchy. So interest in the impact of bias led me to explore blah, 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 or watching a lecture by such and such person on such and such thing led me to think about the impact of bias on, because it could have been a main or one of the themes of their lecture. So you can sort of jump right into it, really, is what I'm trying to say. Jump right into the evidence or the example and give your own specific and supported opinions. Okay, finally, I think this is my final, oh, no, I've got some final tips after this one. What do we look for in a Cambridge personal statement? The first thing I wanted to say, and we can talk more about this if you have questions, we understand at Cambridge that you have sent this personal statement to all of your university choices. All your universities are aware of this, right? So by even saying a Cambridge personal statement, or indeed an Oxford personal statement, that's why there's a little caveat, a little note there. For Cambridge, for applicants who are applying to Cambridge courses, in the My Cambridge application, which is the additional questionnaire that you have to fill in as part of a valid application to Cambridge, there is a space in there to put a Cambridge specific personal statement. Now there's a character limit. I've linked on the slide there the web page, which has all of the information. But that there is a space where you can put your Cambridge specific reflections on your course. If there's something particular about the Cambridge course that you wanted to mention, then you can do that there without taking up the space in the UCAS personal statement, which is going to be read by all of your different universities and courses. Wonderful. So having explained what I mean by Cambridge personal statement, I'm now going to say all of the things that we are looking for in competitive applicants' personal statements. So subject specific and academic in focus. So you explain how specific areas of study or topics within your chosen subject or course area have appealed to you and what you exactly find interesting. So it's really specific and it's academic. Your curiosity, you're not just telling us, you're showing us. It's informed enthusiasm. You're avoiding empty phrases. You've actually explained to us how you yourself have taken the initiative beyond the curriculum that you're studying in school to explore specific questions and ideas in your own time, and that you've used academic articles, resources to do so. You've given us specific examples, which I think I've already said actually, but it's important, so I'll say it again. You have told us what you found interesting, what you understood. Maybe you have challenged something that you've read or found in a resource. You have explained some interesting connections that you have drawn between different resources. And finally, you demonstrate to us that you've got this research-minded approach. You demonstrate essentially your potential and your aptitude for university level study. So you explain to us the process by which you thought about something, came across something in an article, then went away and did something about that. You wrote an essay, you did a project, you researched further about it. Whatever it might be, you have sort of followed your curiosity through these academic resources. Some final tips then. Remember, be honest about what you're genuinely interested in, rather than including what you think we're looking for. So the suggestions on our really helpful resource, the super-curricular suggestions document that I've linked here in the slide, they are just examples of some good starting points. They're by no means a prescriptive reading list that we will definitely need you to have covered in your personal statement. That's not what these are for, these suggestions in that document. That's not the point of them, the purpose of them at all. They're good springboards for you to do your own super-curricular research. Remember, as I've said already, write for an educated subject-specific audience. You don't need to give definitions. Yeah, you don't need to waste the time, waste the characters doing that. If you're applying to universities that interview and they might use personal statements as a basis for discussion in your interview, make sure then that you would have something else to say about what you've put in your personal statement. So often some students fall down because they think that the personal statement, once they've submitted it, they therefore don't ever have to do any more supercurricular research. What I would urge you is to see this supercurricular activity, this subject exploration that you're doing, make it habitual for you. You should enjoy it, because if you're going to be studying a subject for 3 or more years, studying it sort of at that university level, really getting your teeth into the subjects that you find most interesting, that should be enjoyable for you. So you can carry on with that, and we would encourage you to carry on with that after you've sent us your personal statement, right? Carry on with the subject exploration, the supercurricular stuff that you were doing in order to write that personal statement in the first place. And that really helps, because it when you are interviewed, if that is part of the application process for you, you will therefore have something else to say. You will have read something else. You will maybe even disagree with what your past self put in your personal statement, and that's great. If you've got the evidence to back it up, if you've read or thought about it in a different way, having discovered some different resource or different text or different author or different way of approaching a question, that's great. Make sure you have something else to say about the things that you've mentioned in your personal statement. And indeed, make sure you have other things that you can say that aren't in your personal statement. We aren't expecting you to be able to put every single bit of supercurricular research that you have done as a university applicant in your personal statement. We're not looking for a sort of a list of every book you've read, for instance. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for you to have taken a few things, connecting them, thinking about them, reflecting on them in interesting ways. But you, of course, will have many other things that you can talk about. Make sure you're engaging critically with the supercurriculars. As I've said, don't just list them. And also you can challenge them. If you have, sort of an evidenced opinion to back that up, you can challenge them. And be selective and prioritize the ones that you want to talk about in detail in these research paragraphs, right? So aim for quality over quantity. Aim for depth over breadth. So don't just list and then therefore not really get down into the real meat of the stuff, as it were. Really select and then go into the depth and reflect. Keep on exploring your subject and start drafting your personal statement now. So the best first draft that you can write is one that's done. So don't worry, your first draft, it's not your final draft. Just get it done, and then you can redraft after that. And finally, I think I said this at the start, but just in case I didn't, please remember that your personal statement is just one part of your application. We holistically assess every individual applicant. So make sure that you are putting it in the context. I remember, if you can believe, it wasn't too long ago, it kind of was now, but I can still remember, in any case, the summer of writing my personal statement for my university applications. And it really sort of consumed me, if I'm honest. And if I could tell my applicant self anything, it would be enjoy the exploration, and the writing of the personal statement will come, but don't get too focused on it, thinking this has to be the most perfect document and essay that I've ever produced. Try and really enjoy the things that you're doing that will produce your personal statement, and just have a go. Write that first draft. I was really put off by the blinking cursor on the Word document. So yeah, remember, it's just one part, and we look at all of the different elements of your application holistically and contextually. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now. So anyone who's watching the recording, I've got the email address that you can use to send any further questions. So please do that if you have any questions having watched this session recording, and thank you very much.